Hey students, today we're going to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy or CRP or culturally responsive teaching. Obviously, you've already read an article on this. So let's talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. A lot of you commented you didn't know what this word pedagogy was or pedagogy. It's pronounced both ways. There's not a proper way to spell it. What is it? Well, Google tells us that it's the method or practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. So the practice of teaching, the methods of teaching, what you're actually doing in the classroom, that's your pedagogy. That's what we're talking about. And obviously then culturally relevant pedagogy would be recognizing that we can teach in different ways to different students based on who they are as human beings, that they bring different baggage with them, that they bring different life experiences with them, and that we can differentiate our instruction to best reach all of our students instead of just teaching to the masses. We want to teach to the individual. So that's what we're looking at. Gloria Ladson-Billings, she was kind of the founder of this concept of culturally relevant pedagogy. A lot of her work happened back in the 90s and was in concert with some of the work that Carol Dweck did on growth mindset and in thinking, what can I control? Well, you have that on one side, and then you have Gloria Ladson-Billings. I think they were both at Stanford at the time, who was thinking about how can we make sure that everyone has equal opportunities to succeed. So these two concepts go to very together really nicely. She talks about these three pillars, which we're going to go over right now: academic achievement, cultural competence, and socio-political consciousness. In schools, historically, we have focused on that first one, academic achievement. Gloria Ladson-Billings and the article that you read focus on this middle one, cultural competence. And socio-political consciousness is a tricky one because it is something that we typically shy away from, not just in schools, but anywhere public in our culture, religion, politics, other things. We step on eggshells, when we talk around those topics. And so we'll get into some of that here in a minute. Let's talk about academic achievement first. I'm going to just read this slide. It says that the primary function of a teacher's role is to cultivate the minds of their students. And historically, that's all a teacher was: someone who would be a sage from the stage that would fill empty minds with knowledge. That was what teachers did. However, it says culturally relevant teachers know the content, they know the learner, and that's where this is coming in, and they know how to teach the content to the learner. So we're not discounting that content knowledge. If you want to be a good math teacher, you better understand math. You better understand how things fit together. If you want to teach history, you have to understand history. And the best teachers are really passionate about those content areas. But it's more than that. It's understanding the learner. Because if you can understand the motivations of the learner or the biases of the learner, then you're going to teach it in different ways. And so it's not enough just to understand the content of the course, but you have to understand your learners as well so that you can know how to best teach the learners. Now, cultural competency, this is where Dr. Ladson-Billings really focused, and the article you read this week talked about this. It says that teachers understand culture and its role in education, so that they take responsibility for learning about their students' culture and community. And then because of that, they interrogate their own identity, culture, biases, and privilege. Now, that's a hard thing to do. And when we think about what is the best way to accomplish that, and I'll revisit this here in a few minutes, but obviously the best way to understand another culture is to experience it, right? And some of you have probably had the experience in your life of moving away from home and living within another culture for a period of time, whether that be a study abroad where you went for a few weeks or a semester. Maybe you did like a church mission where you were there for a year or two. But if you've had that experience to experience another culture, you're probably way more empathetic to that culture onto what their needs are, how they best learn, how to accommodate certain situations. And so that's really critical. Now, this second part, which is hard, which is identifying our own biases because of the culture we're raised in. I know this was a hard thing for me as I grew up, and I'm still struggling with it. I grew up here in rural Utah, in a very white community where over 90% was the same religion, probably over 80% was the same political leanings. And that was the culture I grew up in. And so, of course, I had biases. In fact, I catch myself now, even with saying things that maybe are insensitive to other cultures, that as I grew up, these were just sayings that we said around the house. And I didn't realize they might be offensive or they might be misunderstood according to who my audience was. And so I certainly have those biases, and I still do. Even though I've lived all over the country and I've traveled all over the world, I still, most of my experiences are with people who are very similar to me in many regards. I spend a lot of time with my best friend who is the same color of skin as me, comes from the same religious background, has the same political leanings, although we disagree occasionally, which is really fun when we go on our evening walks is to debate things. But we're mostly very, very similar. And so I have biases. Now, I can examine those biases, but how do we do that? And I'm going to give some suggestions here in a minute. First, let's talk about socio-political consciousness. This is the idea that teachers actively educate themselves and their students on personal and socio-political issues that impact their students, communities, and the world. Now, again, this is hard because if you're in a kindergarten class and you talk about something that's really important, maybe we talk about gender identity. That's really important. But is it appropriate, given the cultural background of your students and their families? Well, some might argue that you do that, you might lose your job, or you might just have a bunch of angry parents, depending on what kind of information you present to the class and how it's interpreted. And even the best meaning teachers will say something to help their students, and those students might misinterpret, or maybe they won't misinterpret, they'll just disagree. They'll take that information home to their parents. Parents will get upset, they'll call the schools. That happens all the time. And so when it comes to socio-political consciousness, we do have some bounds as teachers, especially as public school teachers in K-12. You have to be sensitive to your audience. And there are some topics that you might stay clear of, not because you don't want to do a disservice to your students, but because you want to protect your own job and well-being. So you have to be sensitive to that. Does that mean you can't talk about hot topic issues? No, do it as is developmentally appropriate and in a sensitive way, and you should be fine. So let's come back to this idea of cultural sensitivity and looking at our own biases. Is it possible for a teacher to understand the cultural identity of each of your students? Each of you should be shaking your head right now and say, no, it's not possible. Is it possible for a teacher to have some understanding of each of their students? Yes. Now, it depends on who your students are, right? So, for example, if you have 30 students in a classroom and you meet with them every day, can you get to know your students pretty well by the end of the year? Yeah, I sure hope so. You should be spending at least enough one-on-one time that you understand some of their background and some of their cultural identity. And we're going to talk here in the near future about cultural load and the stuff that people bring with them into the classroom. So you can do that. Is that different if you teach students for one semester, for 150 or 250-minute sections each week? And so instead of meeting with them 1,200 hours in a year, you're meeting with them 150 hours a year. Or like the lecture I give with you guys, it's a few hours is all a year that I'm actually speaking directly to you. You're going to have a different relationship. You're not going to have the same understanding of your students' cultural identity. However, you can do stuff. Our very first activity in this class, remember, was that community activity where we made a slideshow about ourselves and we shared some of our cultural identity. That was very intentional on my part. I wanted to understand who you are, what you're bringing to this classroom. And you can do a similar assignment with your students. You can also integrate that throughout the year and continue to do getting to know you activities. I think too often teachers give up on stuff like that. They do it in the first week of the school year, and then the rest of the year they're boring and they don't get to know their students. Like, that's half the fun of being a teacher, is getting to know your students, figuring out how they feel about important issues, and being able to debate and discuss with them, even at really early levels with kindergartners, first graders, they have so many cool insights that they can bring to you. So don't do yourself a disservice by shutting down those conversations. Invite good questions, invite them to share about their backgrounds, and you'll be much happier as a teacher if you do so. That's my opinion. All right. Now, this is something that we discussed in our face-to-face classroom, but I want you to at least think about it. Why are some minority groups regularly featured in the media? And when we think about minority groups, I think we all have this bias where we'll think of a particular group or a few particular groups, but other groups maybe don't get the same media attention. Why do you think that is? I'm going to suggest the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Or the squeaky wheel gets the oil when it comes to celebrating culture. And part of that is driven by the media, right? Some of the holidays that we celebrate in our country, whether they be racial or religious, it's because of what the majority favors or what the media favors. When we think about, well, I know this because I was looking through examples of different ethnic and racial groups that we could investigate in this class. And there were certain groups that were way easier to find information on than others. So one of the things that was sad to me is here we live in Southern Utah, at least I do. I don't know where you guys live because you're all virtual. But we have a pretty strong Native American population down here with the Paiute tribe. And if we go a little further south with the Navajo Nation, and it's a fascinating history, disadvantaged group, and they're rarely in the media. Now, part of that is by choice. They choose to live on a reservation, separate. And so it would make sense that they're not as integrated with the popular media that doesn't take place there on the reservation. So there's some understanding to that. However, the largest minority population here in Southern Utah is Hispanic or Latinx, and we rarely hear about them in the media in comparison to other groups like African Americans who do dominate the media, especially in the last few years with Black Lives Matters and other initiatives, even talking about culturally relevant pedagogy. The founders of that term were African Americans. So a lot of the studies that they used really preferenced that group. Now, that's not good or bad. It's just something to be aware of when we think about our own biases and trying to understand others, other cultures. Another issue that we face as teachers is, as hard as we try to understand our students, there are certain things students might not want to talk about and maybe should not talk about. And so we have to be careful when it comes to some of these topics, homelessness, drug addiction, even cultural minorities that are somewhat taboo, gender identity, religion, political leanings, etc. You have to be careful with stuff like that. I know, so most of us maybe haven't experienced these things directly, but have friend, family member that is struggling in one or all of these areas, or struggling is probably the wrong word. This is a state of being, and some of it isn't because a response to a choice, right? Some of us just come from different backgrounds, and a lot of the research I do on intergenerational poverty says that a lot of the situation we find ourselves in now might not be because of anything we did, and it might not even be anything that our parents did, but we're stuck in these certain cycles because if you, for example, have a drug addiction, you're more likely to pass that on to your children. If you grew up in poverty, you're more likely to pass it on to your children. And do students want to talk about welfare? I didn't when I was an elementary school student, when I was in middle school. I even remember when I was in high school, I was so embarrassed about the financial level of my family. And I couldn't afford to eat school lunch. And I was too ashamed to do food stamps and things like that because you had a special card and stuff like that. And so I didn't eat lunch for 4 years. I just skipped it. Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. I didn't want to talk to my teachers about that. I didn't want my peers to know what I was going through in my home life, because in most regards, I was the same as everyone else. It was just when it came to some of these little things like eating school lunch, I was a little different. So I found a different area of the school, and I went there every day for lunch, and I didn't experience lunch with my peers. Now, had I talked to a teacher or a counselor about that, I might have done it differently. But at the time, I just didn't want to talk about it. And I think we need to respect others' wishes to some extent. Now, obviously, when it comes to abuse and negligence and things like that, we need to talk to the right people and get the right kind of help. But in other cases, we need to be sensitive. All right, so let's wind this down. What can you do to identify your own biases and to be more culturally aware? You can easily watch a movie about a different culture, even if it's a movie made for entertainment, and learn something, and that can impact what you do in the classroom. Now, I have some of these suggestions down here when it comes to things like Schizophrenia with a Beautiful Mind. Fantastic movie to understand different mental illnesses. Remember the Titans is my favorite movie of all time. It's mostly entertainment. I love football, but I also love what they did with segregation in the 70s and talked about how they talked about it in this film. So if you haven't seen Remember the Titans, that's a good use of your time to think through historically what happened. When it comes to examining our own biases, watching something like The Pursuit of Happiness or The Soloist have to deal with poverty, substance abuse, homelessness, it's great for empathy to understand where did these people come from, what went wrong in their lives, so they found themselves in this situation. If you want to be inspired, watch something like Hidden Figures. You know, lots of minority groups here with women in science, African Americans, people changing the world. I actually haven't seen the film, but I read the book, and it's a fantastic, very inspiring story. Similarly, McFarland USA with Hispanics that overachieved given their background and kind of their mindset. I love this because I'm a runner, but another one that's very similar to McFarland USA is Spare Parts, which is a robotics competition with a Hispanic group in Arizona. So two great movies, very inspiring, where you're going to glean things. I loved watching McFarland USA. I lived in Miami for a few years, and so Hispanic culture has always been part of my background. But I loved watching McFarland and thinking about quinceañeras and what can I do for my girls when they turn 15, and you know, some of the fun cultural celebrations. I'm not going to go through all these movies, but let me challenge you once again. If you want to have better empathy for your students, seek out some of these movies. And some of them might not be as enjoyable to watch. I know with both A Beautiful Mind and Patch Adams, even things like It's a Beautiful Life, the Italian one about the Holocaust, those are not enjoyable movies to watch as far as they're emotionally draining. You're going to be tired when you're done watching them, but you'll be grateful that you saw it because you learned a new perspective. So that's my challenge for you this week. Seek out opportunities to read books or watch films on cultures that are different from yours. And while you do that, consider how might you treat your students differently? What opportunities might you give to your students based on the cultural background they're bringing to your classroom? All right, that's the class lecture for this week. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.